The meeting room was quiet, save for the subtle ticking of the clock on the wall. A man in his late 40s, Michael Harris, sat at the head of the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his laptop as he scrolled through reports. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, his suit perfectly tailored to exude authority and control, everything about him screamed success. But beneath that polished exterior lay a deeper truth, one that had governed Michael's decisions for most of his life: prejudice. Michael had spent decades working his way up the corporate ladder, securing his role as the regional manager for one of the country's largest retail chains. He prided himself on being able to spot talent and make tough decisions, but more often than not, his biases bled through. The way he treated employees, especially those who didn't look like him, was far from fair. One of those employees was Jason Turner. A young, sharp, and driven black man in his mid-30s, Jason had worked under Michael for 3 years. His performance was exemplary, better than most of his colleagues, and everyone knew it. He had a keen eye for business and an innovative mind that had saved the company millions during a particularly challenging financial quarter. Yet, despite his clear contributions, Jason had been passed over for promotions multiple times. He knew why, though Michael never said it outright. The subtle comments, the extra scrutiny on his work, the constant undermining in meetings, it was all too familiar. But Jason, ever the professional, kept his head down and continued to excel. He had grown up understanding that he would have to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. But today, that resilience would be tested to its limit. The demotion the day began like any other, with Jason arriving early to review reports for an upcoming meeting. As he passed by his colleagues, he caught snippets of conversation that felt unusually tense. "Did you hear? Someone's getting demoted today," one whispered. "Yeah, I think it's Turner," another murmured. Jason furrowed his brow but shrugged it off. Rumors circulated in offices all the time. He wasn't worried. His performance had been stellar. If anyone was due for a change, he assumed it would be a promotion. But as he walked toward his office, he noticed the glances people were giving him, half pity, half concern. His phone buzzed. It was an email from Michael's assistant, requesting a private meeting at 10 a.m. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He knew something was wrong. When 10 a.m. rolled around, Jason walked into Michael's office. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Michael sat behind his desk, a smug expression on his face. "Jason, please have a seat," Michael said, gesturing to the chair in front of him. Jason sat down, his nerves on edge. Michael leaned back, folding his hands in front of him. "I've been reviewing the company's performance, and while some areas have shown improvement, others have not met expectations," Michael began. His voice was cold, detached. Jason nodded, his heart pounding. He knew his department had outperformed many others. He had data to back it up, but something in Michael's tone told him this wasn't about performance. "After careful consideration, I've decided that we need to make some changes in leadership. As of today, you will be demoted to a lower management position." Jason's mind raced. Demoted? For what reason? Michael cleared his throat, clearly annoyed by the question. "Let's just say your leadership style isn't aligning with the company's current direction." "It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. The phrase echoed in Jason's mind. He knew this wasn't about his work, it was about him. It was about the color of his skin, and no amount of data or performance reports would change that. But what could he do? Speak out and risk being labeled as difficult? Jason took a deep breath, suppressing the anger that simmered just below the surface. "I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Good," Michael replied, barely concealing his satisfaction. "You'll start your new role next week." Jason left the office, the weight of injustice pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't stay quiet forever, but today wasn't the day to fight. Not yet. The shift in power weeks passed, and Jason settled into his new, lower position. It was humiliating. Colleagues who had once been his equals now looked down on him, some with sympathy, others with glee. He kept his head down, refusing to let the bitterness consume him. He knew he had to play the long game. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. A memo circulated throughout the company. There had been a major acquisition. The company had been bought out by a private firm, and a new ownership structure was in place. Michael, being the regional manager, called an all-hands meeting to discuss the changes. As employees gathered in the large conference room, Michael stood at the front, looking more anxious than usual. He cleared his throat and addressed the room. As most of you know by now, the company has been acquired. While I don't have all the details yet, we've been informed that the new owners will be visiting this office soon. I expect everyone to remain professional and adaptive to whatever changes may come. Jason sat in the back, listening but not particularly interested. He had resigned himself to the idea that nothing would change for him. The system wasn't built for people like him, and he knew that all too well. But then came the day of the visit. A group of sharply dressed executives entered the building, escorted by security. The employees lined up to greet them, including Michael, who stood at the front, eager to make a good impression. As the group approached, Michael extended his hand to greet the man at the front of the line, and then, the color drained from his face. It was Jason. The reveal Jason, now dressed in a tailored suit, stood confidently in front of Michael. He had always carried himself with grace, but today, there was an undeniable aura of power about him. Jason? Michael stammered, his hand still hanging awkwardly in the air. What are you? I'm the new owner, Jason said calmly, his voice steady and firm. The room went silent. Everyone stared in disbelief, including Michael, whose smug demeanor had vanished entirely. Jason took a moment to let the reality sink in before continuing. You see, Michael, while you were busy trying to hold me back, I was busy building something bigger. I've been part of a venture that has been acquiring companies across the country, including this one. Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked as though he'd been hit by a truck. I've always believed in leading with integrity, something you seem to struggle with, Jason said, his eyes locked on Michael. But don't worry, I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm just here to run this company the way it should have been run all along. The tension in the room was palpable. Michael, now fully aware of his predicament, swallowed hard. You'll be reporting to me from now on, Jason added, turning to address the rest of the room. There will be changes, positive ones, and I expect everyone to contribute to making this a better, more inclusive workplace. As the meeting ended, the employees dispersed, many of them still in shock. Jason lingered for a moment, watching Michael shuffle out of the room, a defeated look on his face. Jason didn't need revenge, he had already won. His success, his rise to the top despite every obstacle, was the ultimate victory. The power of change. In the weeks that followed, the company underwent a transformation. Jason's leadership brought fresh ideas, fair policies, and a renewed focus on diversity and inclusion. Employees who had felt marginalized under Michael's leadership now had a voice, and the company thrived in ways it never had before. As for Michael, he stayed on for a while, but the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the man in charge, and every day, he had to face the reality of working under the man he had once tried to suppress. Eventually, he resigned, unable to cope with the new reality. Jason, on the other hand, continued to lead the company to new heights, proving that true leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about integrity, respect, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And in the end, that was what really mattered. Chapter 1, a promotion that never came. It was a Monday morning like any other. The sun barely crept through the blinds of Jason Turner's one-bedroom apartment as his alarm clock blared, signaling the start of another workweek. Jason groaned as he reached out to silence the noise, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before heading to the kitchen to brew his usual cup of coffee. He'd worked at Arlington Industries for nearly 3 years now, and by all accounts, he should have been thrilled. He'd been hired as an operations supervisor after the company took notice of his stellar performance at his previous job. At Arlington, he'd quickly proven his worth, implementing new processes that saved the company thousands of dollars. His colleagues respected him, and his team always met their targets, often exceeding expectations. Everything was falling into place, except for one thing. Jason had been passed over for promotion 3 times. It didn't make sense. His work was consistently exceptional, and even senior leadership recognized his contributions. Yet, every time an opportunity for advancement came, his name was conveniently left out of the running. The people who were promoted were often less experienced, less capable, and, unsurprisingly, none of them looked like him. It was a pattern that had become all too familiar in his career. As he poured his coffee, Jason's mind wandered back to the last promotion he had been denied. 6 months ago, the regional manager, Michael Harris, had pulled him into his office for what Jason assumed was good news. After all, his department had just achieved record-breaking profits, and Michael himself had sent Jason a congratulatory email. But as Jason sat across from Michael, the air had felt different. Jason, "You're doing great work," Michael had started, his voice dripping with insincerity. "I want to acknowledge your contributions to the company, truly impressive. However, after reviewing all the candidates, we've decided to go in a different direction for the senior position." Jason remembered the sting of that moment, the way his heart had dropped. He had forced himself to smile and nod, biting back the urge to ask the real question, why. Michael had continued with his rehearsed speech, throwing around terms like company fit and long-term vision, but Jason knew the truth. It wasn't about fit. It wasn't about vision. It was about something much simpler, something that had followed him his entire life. Michael didn't see him as leadership material because of the color of his skin. That night, Jason had gone home, disappointed but not surprised. He'd always been taught to work harder, to strive for excellence in the face of adversity, but this was a reminder that no matter how hard he worked, certain doors would remain closed simply because of who he was. He had considered leaving the company, but deep down, he knew walking away wasn't the solution. He loved his work, and more importantly, he believed in the people he worked with. He wasn't about to let someone else dictate his future, at least not without a fight. Chapter 2, a meeting with Michael. Monday mornings at Arlington Industries were always busy, and this one was no different. The office buzzed with activity as employees filed in, setting up their workstations, catching up on emails, and preparing for the week ahead. Jason arrived early, as usual, to review the latest performance reports for his department. His team had once again exceeded their quarterly goals, and he was proud of what they had accomplished. It was moments like these that made all the hard work worth it. As Jason sat down at his desk, a notification popped up on his computer screen, a calendar invite from Michael Harris's assistant. The subject line read, 10 a.m., one-on-one meeting with Michael Harris. Jason frowned slightly. It wasn't unusual for Michael to schedule last-minute meetings, but the timing felt off. There had been no major issues lately, and if anything, the department was performing better than ever. He clicked the accept button and made a mental note to prepare. Meetings with Michael were always tense. The regional manager was known for his rigid management style, his condescending tone, and, most disturbingly, the thinly veiled racism that seemed to color his every decision. Though he never said it outright, Michael's actions spoke volumes. Jason had seen it time and time again, not just with himself, but with other minority employees who were consistently overlooked, undervalued, and treated differently. At 9:45 a.m., Jason gathered his notes and made his way to Michael's office. The hallway leading to Michael's corner office was quiet, with large windows overlooking the city skyline. Jason knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. Michael was seated behind his large mahogany desk, typing away on his laptop. "Jason, come in," Michael said, not bothering to look up. Jason took a seat across from him, waiting for the conversation to begin. The room was filled with the faint hum of the city below, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Michael finally looked up, closing his laptop. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. "I've been reviewing the department's performance," he began, his tone carefully neutral. "And while your team has been doing well, there are some areas of concern." Jason raised an eyebrow. Areas of concern? He knew this game well. Anytime he pushed back or asked questions, Michael would deflect, change the subject, or bring up some minor issue to justify his actions. Michael nodded. "Yes, particularly in leadership. I've noticed that while you're effective in managing day-to-day operations, there's been a lack of, let's call it, strategic vision for the future. The company is looking for someone who can take us to the next level." Jason clenched his fists under the table. This was the same excuse Michael had used every time. He wanted to ask, how can there be a lack of vision when I've implemented strategies that have consistently driven success? But he knew it wouldn't matter. Michael had already made up his mind. "I've given this a lot of thought," Michael continued, "and after careful consideration, I've decided to restructure your role." Jason's stomach dropped. "We'll be demoting you to a lower management position effective next week." For a moment, the words didn't register. Jason stared at Michael, trying to process what he had just heard. Demoted? For what reason? He had outperformed nearly every other department head, and his team had consistently delivered results. This wasn't just unfair, it was blatant discrimination. Jason's voice was steady when he finally spoke. "May I ask what led to this decision?" "My performance has been above expectations, and the department's results have consistently improved." Michael smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not personal, Jason. We just need to ensure that the right people are in the right positions for the company's future growth." The right people. Jason's blood boiled at the insinuation. He wanted to shout, to call Michael out on his racism, but he knew that wouldn't change anything. This wasn't about his work, it was about him. And Michael knew he could get away with it. Jason took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I see," he said quietly. "Thank you for letting me know." Michael nodded, satisfied with the response. "Good. I'm sure you'll adapt to your new role in no time." As Jason left the office, he felt the weight of injustice pressing down on him. He had worked so hard, given everything he had to this company, only to be pushed down by someone who couldn't see past his own prejudice. But as angry as he was, Jason knew one thing: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Chapter 3, A Chance Encounter. That evening, Jason sat at his kitchen table, replaying the conversation in his mind. The demotion stung, but it wasn't just about the title or the pay cut, it was about respect. He had earned his place in that company through years of hard work, dedication, and results. And yet, it had all been dismissed by one man's narrow-minded views. As he sipped his coffee, Jason's phone buzzed. It was an email from an old friend, Marcus. Marcus was someone Jason had met years ago during a business conference. The two had hit it off instantly, bonding over their shared experiences as black professionals navigating the often unforgiving corporate world. While Jason had stayed at Arlington, Marcus had moved on to start his own company, a small but growing investment firm that focused on acquiring undervalued businesses. "Hey Jason," the email began. "Long time no talk. I've got a business proposition I think you might be interested in. Call me when you get a chance." Jason raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He hadn't spoken to Marcus in months, but the timing of the email felt fortuitous. He quickly dialed Marcus's number. "Jason, my man. How's it going?" Marcus's deep, familiar voice greeted him on the other end of the line. Jason chuckled. "Could be better, honestly. But what's this proposition you're talking about?" Marcus paused for a moment before speaking. "I've been working on a major acquisition deal, and I think you might be the perfect person to help me run things once it goes through." Jason leaned forward in his chair, suddenly very interested. "What kind of acquisition?" "It's a retail chain. They've been struggling for a while, but with the right leadership and strategy, I think we can turn it around." "A retail chain?" Jason's mind raced. Could it be, which chain? Jason asked, his heart pounding. Marcus paused for a moment before answering, "Arlington Industries." Chapter 2, The Offer. Jason sat in stunned silence, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. Arlington Industries? The very company that had just demoted him. It seemed too surreal to be true, but Marcus's voice on the other end of the line was filled with the kind of conviction Jason had come to trust over the years. "Are you serious?" Jason finally asked, struggling to contain his disbelief. "You're planning to buy Arlington?" "That's right," Marcus replied with a confident tone. "We've been negotiating with their board for a few months now. The company's been underperforming, as you know, and the shareholders are looking for a way out. My firm put together a deal that's pretty hard for them to refuse. Once the acquisition is finalized, I want you to come on board and help me turn things around." Jason leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. After everything that had happened with Michael, the idea of coming back into the company with a new role, especially one with real power, was both thrilling and daunting. He thought back to the years he'd spent at Arlington, the long hours, the hard work, and the constant struggle to be seen. Now, the tables were turning in a way he never could have anticipated. "But why me?" Jason asked, still processing the enormity of the offer. "There are plenty of people you could bring in for a job like this." Marcus laughed. "Are you kidding? I've seen your work. You know Arlington inside and out, and you've got the experience to make this transition smooth. Plus, I trust you. You've always been one of the most level-headed and hard-working people I know. You've got the vision that company needs. And, let's be honest, after the way they've treated you, don't you think it's time to shake things up?" Jason felt a flicker of satisfaction at the thought. He had always believed in leading with integrity, no matter how unfair the circumstances, but the idea of walking back into Arlington as a decision-maker, especially after what Michael had done to him, was undeniably appealing. "When does this all go down?" Jason asked, already feeling the adrenaline building. Marcus didn't miss a beat. We're wrapping up the final details this week. I'd say by the end of next month, the deal will be signed, sealed, and delivered. After that, we'll need someone to run the show. And that someone is you, if you're up for it. Jason let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He was up for it. More than up for it. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to not only prove himself, but also to right the wrongs that had been inflicted on him and others at the company. I'm in, Jason said, a grin spreading across his face. Let's do this. Chapter 3, Tides of Change. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind for Jason. On the surface, his day-to-day life at Arlington continued as normal. He kept his head down, did his work, and maintained the professionalism that had become second nature to him. But beneath the calm exterior, Jason was preparing for the monumental shift that was about to take place. That he kept in close contact with Marcus, who kept him updated on the progress of the acquisition. By all accounts, the deal was moving forward without any major hiccups, and the countdown to the official takeover had begun. Jason couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just about a career move, it was personal. Meanwhile, Michael Harris seemed blissfully unaware of what was coming. He continued to run the office with the same smug arrogance, oblivious to the fact that his reign was about to come to an abrupt end. Jason watched from the sidelines, biting his tongue as Michael held meetings about the future of the company and maintaining leadership excellence. Little did Michael know, the company's future was about to look very different. As the acquisition date approached, Jason began to reflect on the significance of what was happening. For years, he had worked under the shadow of managers like Michael, men who wielded their power carelessly, often at the expense of others. But now, Jason was in a position to change that. He wasn't just stepping into a leadership role, he was stepping into an opportunity to create an environment where people were valued for their contributions, not judged by their appearance. It was a responsibility Jason took seriously. He had seen firsthand the damage that systemic bias could cause, and he knew there were others at Arlington who had experienced the same kind of discrimination he had. This wasn't just about proving a point to Michael, it was about building a company that was truly inclusive, where talent and hard work were recognized, regardless of race, background, or gender. Chapter 4, The Day of Reckoning. The day of the takeover arrived, and the energy in the office was palpable. Rumors had been swirling for weeks that something big was about to happen, but no one seemed to know exactly what. Michael had been unusually quiet in the days leading up to the announcement, which only fueled the speculation. Jason arrived at the office early that morning, feeling a mix of anticipation and calm. He knew today was going to be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire company. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed the usual group of employees gathered around the coffee machine, whispering among themselves. You hear anything new about this buyout? One of them asked. I heard it's some big investment firm. They're probably going to clean house, another replied. Jason kept his head down and made his way to his desk, smiling to himself. Little did they know that at 10 a.m., an all-hands meeting was called in the main conference room. The announcement had finally come. Employees filed into the room, murmuring nervously as they took their seats. Jason sat near the back, observing the scene quietly. Michael stood at the front of the room, pacing slightly as he waited for everyone to settle down. Once the room was full, Michael cleared his throat and began to speak. As many of you know, there have been some changes happening at the corporate level over the past few weeks. Today, I'm here to officially announce that Arlington Industries has been acquired by a private equity firm. This is a significant moment for the company, and while there may be some restructuring, I want to assure you that we will continue to operate with the same values and commitment to excellence that we always have. Jason couldn't help but smirk at the irony of Michael's words. Commitment to excellence. If only he knew what was really about to happen. At that moment, the door to the conference room opened, and a group of sharply dressed executives entered. At the head of the group was Marcus, looking every bit the successful businessman he had become. Michael's expression shifted from one of confidence to confusion as Marcus made his way to the front of the room. Good morning, everyone, Marcus said, his voice commanding the room's attention. As Michael mentioned, my firm has acquired Arlington Industries, and we're excited to begin this new chapter. There will indeed be some changes, and we believe these changes will help the company grow and thrive in the years to come. Michael, still standing at the front of the room, seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure. He turned to Marcus, clearly trying to figure out where he fit into all of this. And, what exactly will my role be in this new structure? Marcus smiled politely. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce someone who will be playing a key role in the company's future leadership. He turned toward the back of the room, where Jason sat. Jason, would you mind coming up here? The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Jason. Slowly, he stood up and made his way to the front of the room, feeling the weight of the moment. As he approached the podium, he caught a glimpse of Michael's face. It was a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. Jason Turner, Marcus said, placing a hand on Jason's shoulder, will be stepping into a senior leadership role at Arlington. His experience, vision, and commitment to excellence make him the perfect person to help lead this company into the future. Jason met Michael's gaze, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The power dynamic between them had shifted so dramatically that it was almost hard to comprehend. Jason, the man Michael had demoted just weeks ago, was now his superior. The room erupted in applause as Jason took his place next to Marcus. Michael, meanwhile, stood frozen in place, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Chapter 3, A New Beginning. The applause in the room echoed long after it faded, leaving a quiet tension in its wake. Jason, now standing confidently at the front of the room, felt a surge of emotions. This was the moment he had worked for, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been held back by prejudice, by bias, by people like Michael Harris. Yet, Jason knew this was only the beginning. Marcus, sensing the room's restlessness, gestured for everyone to settle down. Thank you all for your support, he began. As you know, transitions like this are never easy. Change is difficult, but necessary for growth. Jason and I have spent weeks discussing the future of this company, and we are committed to creating an environment that values integrity, hard work, and, most importantly, fairness. Jason nodded. He had been thinking about this moment since the day Marcus made him the offer. It wasn't just about taking over Arlington, it was about transforming it into a place where everyone could succeed, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. Jason stepped up to the microphone. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of his colleagues. Some looked surprised, others impressed. But one gaze stood out, Michael's. His face was a mixture of disbelief and anger, his once smug expression now replaced with something much more uncertain. Thank you, Marcus, Jason said, addressing the room. It's an honor to be standing here today. When I first joined Arlington, I saw potential, not just in the company, but in the people who work here. I still see that potential, and I believe we can take Arlington to new heights. But to do that, we need to change the way we operate. Jason let the words hang in the air for a moment, the weight of the statement hitting the room hard. He continued, for too long, talent has been overlooked, and voices have gone unheard. That stops now. From today forward, this company will operate on the principles of merit, respect, and equality. No one will be held back because of who they are or where they come from. And I expect each and every one of you to be a part of that change. The room was silent as Jason finished his speech, but there was an unmistakable energy in the air. People were listening, really listening, and for the first time, Jason felt like his voice was being heard. Marcus stepped back up to the podium. Thank you, Jason, he said. I think we're all excited to see where this new chapter takes us. Now, I'm sure many of you have questions about the restructuring, so we'll be holding individual meetings with the leadership team over the next few days to discuss the details. As the meeting concluded, the employees began filing out of the room, some lingering to congratulate Jason, others whispering among themselves. But one person didn't move. Michael. Jason watched as Michael stood there, arms crossed, his face tight with suppressed anger. It was clear he hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that the very person he had tried to undermine would rise to a position of power over him. Jason approached him, his heart pounding slightly. This was the moment he had anticipated for weeks, and yet, standing face to face with Michael, he felt none of the vindication he thought he would. Michael, Jason began, his tone calm but firm. Michael's jaw clenched. Jason. There was a long pause, the two men standing in silent confrontation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt smaller, quieter, as though the entire office had shrunk around them. I imagine this isn't the outcome you expected, Jason said, choosing his words carefully. Michael's eyes flickered with barely restrained hostility. I don't know what you're talking about. Jason raised an eyebrow. You demoted me, Michael. You overlooked my work. You dismissed my ideas, and you did it because of your own bias. I'm not here to rub it in, but I want you to know that things are going to change. Michael scoffed, his face hardening. You think you can come in here and just erase years of hard work? You think you can just, Jason cut him off, his voice steely. I'm not here to erase anything. I'm here to build something better. And that means holding people accountable. For a moment, Michael said nothing. His face twisted, as though he was searching for the right response, but the words wouldn't come. He had been caught off guard, and now he was standing on the edge of irrelevance in a company he once controlled with an iron fist. You should consider your position carefully, Michael, Jason said, his voice softer now. I'm not looking to get rid of people who want to help this company grow. But I need to know if you're willing to be part of the solution, or if you're going to continue being part of the problem. Michael's expression shifted, the anger fading into something more guarded. So what are you saying? I'm not being fired. Jason shook his head. No. I don't believe in that kind of leadership. But your role is going to change, and you're going to be held to the same standard as everyone else. The days of playing favorites and running this place like your personal kingdom are over. There was a long pause, and for the first time, Michael looked genuinely unsure. It was clear that Jason had taken the upper hand in their dynamic, and Michael wasn't used to being on the losing side. We'll see how this goes, Michael finally muttered, turning on his heel and walking out of the room without another word. Jason watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of closure. He hadn't needed to humiliate Michael, just seeing the man stripped of his power was enough. Jason knew that true change didn't come from revenge, but from building something better. Chapter 4, Building the Future. In the days that followed, the changes at Arlington Industries came quickly. Jason, now a senior executive, worked closely with Marcus and the board to implement new policies that promoted fairness, inclusion, and transparency. Employees who had been overlooked for years were given opportunities to step into leadership roles, and the toxic culture that had festered under Michael's reign began to dissolve. It wasn't easy. There were challenges at every turn, pushback from certain factions of the old leadership, resistance to new policies, and the inevitable tension that came with any major organizational shift. But Jason remained focused. He had a vision for what Arlington could be, and he wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. As the weeks turned into months, Jason's leadership began to pay off. Productivity increased, employee satisfaction skyrocketed, and the company's profits soared. It became clear to everyone that the changes weren't just good for morale, they were good for business. Jason's personal life also began to improve. With the weight of his demotion lifted and his career back on track, he found himself reconnecting with friends and family he had distanced himself from during the most stressful periods of his career. His evenings, once filled with endless reports and sleepless nights, were now spent enjoying the company of those he loved. And as for Michael, he remained at the company, albeit in a much diminished role. Jason had given him a chance to adapt, and while he wasn't thrilled with the new direction, he had begrudgingly accepted his place in the new order. Over time, Michael became just another employee, no longer the tyrant who ruled the office, but a man trying to keep up with the tides of change. One afternoon, months after the acquisition, Jason found himself standing in the same conference room where everything had changed. He looked out over the office floor, watching the employees go about their work. The atmosphere was different now, lighter, more collaborative. People seemed happier, more engaged. Marcus walked in, clapping Jason on the shoulder. You did it, man, he said, grinning. This place is thriving because of you. Jason smiled, but there was a humility in his expression. We did it, he corrected. None of this would have happened without you giving me the chance. Marcus shook his head. Don't sell yourself short. You earned this. As they stood there, surveying the company they had rebuilt together, Jason couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. He had taken on a system that was rigged against him, and he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. The journey had been long, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Jason stood at the window of his office, gazing out at the bustling cityscape below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the skyline, a fitting metaphor for the journey he had been on, one of struggle, perseverance, and ultimately, victory. The building he now stood in, once a place that had felt cold and oppressive, was now alive with energy, filled with people who were thriving in the environment he had helped create, that it was hard to believe how much had changed in just a few months. The man who had once been overlooked, undervalued, and pushed aside had now become one of the most influential figures at Arlington Industries. Jason still remembered the feeling of injustice when Michael Harris had demoted him without cause, a decision driven by prejudice and a narrow view of who was worthy of leadership. That moment had lit a fire inside him, a determination not to let someone else define his worth, but now, standing on the other side of that battle, Jason didn't feel the bitterness or need for revenge that had once simmered within him. Instead, he felt something far more powerful, a deep sense of purpose. He hadn't just survived the storm, he had changed the landscape entirely. Jason turned away from the window, looking around the office that had once been the very symbol of his frustration. Now, it was a place of opportunity and hope. The walls were adorned with pictures of the company's diverse teams, celebrating milestones and successes that had been achieved under his leadership. It wasn't just about the numbers or the profits, though those had improved dramatically. It was about the people, the lives he had impacted by creating an environment where talent was recognized, regardless of race or background. His thoughts drifted to Michael Harris, the man who had been the face of everything wrong with the company. Michael had always been confident in his power, believing that the structure he upheld would never change. He had been a gatekeeper, controlling who rose and who remained stagnant. Jason could still picture the look on Michael's face that day in the conference room when the new ownership had been announced. The disbelief, the confusion, and finally, the realization that the very person he had tried to suppress was now his superior. Jason had thought that moment would bring him satisfaction, but in truth, it had been bittersweet. Watching Michael's downfall wasn't as fulfilling as he'd once imagined. It wasn't Michael's humiliation that mattered to him, what mattered was the systemic change that followed. Michael had eventually resigned, unable to adapt to the new reality where he could no longer control people through fear or favoritism. He had faded into obscurity, his influence gone, and while Jason knew there were many like him still out there in the corporate world, he also knew that change was possible. He was living proof of that. The sound of laughter pulled Jason out of his thoughts. He glanced out into the hallway and saw a group of young employees chatting animatedly as they headed toward the elevator. They were from the new leadership development program Jason had launched, a program specifically designed to mentor employees from underrepresented backgrounds, giving them the tools and support to rise through the ranks. It was one of the many initiatives he had championed since taking on his new role, and it had already made a significant impact on the company culture. Jason smiled to himself. This was the real victory, not taking down Michael or claiming a title, but creating an environment where people could thrive, where their voices were heard, and where they were judged on their abilities, not their appearance. He had seen firsthand how much potential had been wasted in the old system, and he had vowed to never let that happen under his watch. His phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him back to the present. It was a message from Marcus, board meeting next week. Let's talk about expansion plans. Big things ahead. Jason chuckled softly. Marcus had been the catalyst for this entire transformation, believing in Jason when others had tried to tear him down. Together, they had taken a company that was drowning in its own outdated practices and turned it into a beacon of progress and innovation. The expansion Marcus mentioned was just the next step in what had already been a monumental journey. They were looking at acquiring new businesses, expanding into new markets, things Jason had once only dreamed about. As he put his phone down, Jason reflected on how much his life had changed. He had gone from being a man fighting just to stay afloat to someone steering the ship. And yet, he hadn't lost sight of what truly mattered. Success, he had learned, wasn't about titles or money. It was about creating a legacy, one that would continue to lift others up long after he was gone. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his assistant, a young woman who had been part of the mentorship program. "Mr. Turner," she said, smiling, "the team is ready for you in the conference room." Jason nodded, gathering his notes. "I'll be right there." As he walked toward the conference room, he passed by the office spaces, each filled with employees from all walks of life, working together, collaborating, and thriving. This was what he had envisioned, a company where everyone had a chance to succeed, where hard work and dedication were rewarded, and where the walls of prejudice had been torn down. When he entered the conference room, the team was already seated, waiting for his input on the next big project. As he sat down, Jason felt a surge of gratitude. He had been given an opportunity not just to succeed for himself, but to pave the way for others. And that, more than anything, was what made him proud. "Let's get started," Jason said, looking around the room at the faces of the team he had built. They were a diverse group, talented, motivated, and ready to make a difference. And with them by his side, Jason knew there was no limit to what they could achieve. The road ahead was full of possibilities, and for the first time in his career, Jason wasn't walking it alone. Together, they were building something lasting, something that would stand as a testament to the power of perseverance, integrity, and true leadership. As the meeting began, Jason sat back, confident in the knowledge that the future was bright, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. In the end, Jason had not only rewritten his own story, he had rewritten the story of Arlington Industries, transforming it into a place where anyone could rise, and where the values of fairness, inclusion, and respect would guide its future for generations to come.